you doing? Hey, come on! That is, of course, American for Achtung. And I know this because at the weekend I watched some of the movie Midway. Appropriately, I started halfway through. Have you seen it, Jim?
Yeah, I did. I got employed to do some public relations for it.
Oh my God!
I had to go on do loads of radio interviews and talk about what really happened.
You see the guy because Best, the guy they based it on. You read Best's story; it's an amazing story, right?
Yeah. He is amazing.
He's an amazing.
He never flew
guy.
again.
Yeah, I know, because he, what was it, hydrogen chloride or something in his oxygen system, wasn't it, at altitude?
Yeah, and he got massive lung
scarred his lungs in it. Yeah, that's right. And it reactivated some latent TB he had. Like it's an
it was like the wartime equivalent of long COVID for him.
Yeah, but basically what he wasn't was a guy going around going, I'm gonna show these Japanese who's boss. It's just like the machismo in it is insane.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
And the really funny scene where when Nimitz is taken to meet the code breaker to have it explained to him, and it's Woody Harrelson, who I love, and you can, I don't know.
He was much better in Thin Red Line.
Oh God, yeah! But he just feels like someone recently, a comedian I know recently described Daniel Craig in the Bond films as like he's doing Coriolanus in Paw Patrol, right?
That's very good.
And that's really what Woody Harrelson in that. I mean, it's terrible. And the dive bombing, the way the dive bombing is portrayed as them literally diving vertically, like straight down on the vertical. It's absurd, isn't it?
Yeah, it is absolutely absurd.
I mean,
I thought the action sequences were quite exciting, though.
They're incredibly exciting, but also absurd. I thought the submarine action sequences actually were really, really good. They're very brief, but I really liked those. I thought those work well because also they can't change the story of that sub that wastes all that destroyer's time, that then as a result, or is it a cruiser's time they waste, and as a result that is the ship that's then spotted steaming back to the carrier group. The wake of that ship leads them to the way the jigsaw of the story should all work, but instead.
I just find what I find amazing about all those war films, and I haven't watched Mincemeat yet, and I haven't quite got around to watching Munich, but I'm absolutely going to. But nearly all of them disappoint, partly because the history's bad, but partly because they're trying to turn it into something it wasn't. When the original is actually so much better than the thing they're trying to turn it into. And I never understand this because listen, I've read Blake Snyder's Save the Cat. I've read loads of books about movie script writing. So it's not like I'm talking from the position of being a complete kind of Hollywood script ignoramus.
Yeah.
There is narrative art, there are principles, there are rules, there's the 3 acts, all the rest of it when you're doing a Hollywood script. The problem is with all this stuff is the original is so much better.
Yeah, there's absolutely
the real drama is better. You don't need, it is actually much more. It would be much more thrilling to see a dive bombing at an angle because there's clearly harder to aim, which makes it more exciting and more jeopardy. Anyone watching that is never going to, in a million years, believe that a dive bomber is diving vertically and then suddenly miraculously kind of pull out at the last.
Well, which is what he does, which is what,
and it just looks absurd.
It does. There's a previous scene where they attack an airbase, where Best attacks an airbase and basically blows up all the aircraft on the runway, and a hangar. And he's dive bombed vertically and pulls out, and you think, and the bloke's going, his gunner or navigator, whatever, the bloke behind him is going 4,000, we assume feet, right? I'm assuming feet. 3,500, 3,000, 2,000, 1,500 feet. And you think, but they're going, it's vertical. They're dead. If you're 1,500 feet,
Yeah, you're not pulling out of that.
What? And so I basically sat there going, what? A lot of it. And like you say, there is just There's just no need. And there's really interesting stuff in that. Obviously the Japanese carrier group have to control their fire for fear of hitting the carriers. They have to control their anti-aircraft fire. So there's this sort of game of cat and mouse at the plane. It's not just this sort of wall of video game fire which you have in the film. Where it's literally like a video game, like a firework display as he's flying down at the carrier. They have to hold their fire for fear. There's all that going on. The pilots obviously knew that. So they knew that they had to. That's what they had. That there was. It wasn't just point the plane at the thing from a vast height and pull out to 1,000 feet.
No, it's absolutely absurd. I mean, that is. I suppose they're all thinking, okay, so lots of people play Call of Duty, lots of people play, World of Tanks,
and have seen
Star
Wars.
What we need to do is do it. And we need to do a kind of sort of movie version of this. To get the younger generation in.
Yeah.
But actually, if you just made a really good war film, everyone will watch it.
Well, there's all the sort of Top Gunnery in it as well. Any film with aviation, American aviation with aircraft carriers is in the lee of the Top Gun. There's nothing you could, and there's sort of nothing you can do. Well, arguably, there's plenty you could do about that cinematically. You could actually decide rather than follow, you could lead with the film. That's movie making, isn't it? And
everyone has to be unbelievably ripped. And everyone has to talk 100% in cliches. And it's so boring because actually, how much cooler would it be to actually have someone who's actually looks a bit wimpy?
But I turned it, just a scrawny guy. I mean,
just a scrawny guy, which nearly all pilots were in those days.
Yeah, I mean, I turned it off before the Yorktown got hit. Not because I thought, I can't possibly cope with the idea of the Americans losing a carrier, right? Because they're the good guys. But just basically because I was bored. I thought this is boring, which is how you make the story of the Battle of Midway boring.
Yeah, which is amazing. Which is and it is. I've been doing quite a lot of. I mean, we can maybe talk about this in a minute, but I've been doing a little bit on the Pacific War, and fascinating it is too.
Well, after all, it's 80 years ago today. A US committee appointed to investigate the attack on Pearl Harbor blamed Admiral Husband E. Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter Short for failing to take appropriate measures after the warnings they'd been given. They got death threats. Unbelievable. By the way, you're listening to We Have Ways to Make You Talk with me, Al Murray and James Holland. We just plunged straight in, didn't we?
Yeah, but to be honest, I mean, receiving death threats then, that was obviously a bigger deal than it is now, where getting death threats now is obviously...
from
part and parcel,
Lord,
right?
Yes, exactly, from Lord Scrotum 5927 on Twitter.
You ought to be dead, I'm going to kill you.
Yeah,
okay, fine,
exactly.
Whatever.
By the way, we'll just do... Should we do our admin? Because we've got a little bit of admin to do.
A little bit of admin, yeah.
Yeah, okay. A reminder, this July we are holding a major Second World War festival in a field near Silverstone Racetrack in Buckinghamshire.
Somewhere in a field in...
Exactly, somewhere in a field in England. If you'd like to see the greatest collection of Second World War military vehicles assembled since the launch of Operation Veritable I'm going for today, why not join us? There'll be a host of brilliant speakers. We'll be firing some very large and noisy guns. There'll be beer, movies and music. Those that came before, we can reassure you it's a different programme, but it's the same vibe. Go to our website for ticket information. That's wehaveways.com/festival. Weekend tickets, day ticket. Yeah.
And some A1 historians coming.
Oh my goodness, yes. I mean,
Max Hastings on Churchill.
Yeah, and that's not a heavy pencil either. That's written in
That's bold. That's permanent. That's
exactly.
Yep, that's happening.
That's absolutely fantastic. I mean, I'm absolutely fantastic. On this Thursday's pod, we have a fascinating conversation with Caroline Shenton, in which she explains the extraordinary lengths Britain went to in order to safeguard our national art treasures. That was an incredible chat, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I really liked her. She had a really, really nice twinkle, didn't she?
Yeah, absolutely.
And wry sense of humour.
And it's got the lot, hasn't it? It's eccentrics and arty people and all that sort of thing. If you love the quirky, almost eccentric aspects of the war, this is for you. And for those that aren't aware, we run a members club here at We Have Ways of Making You Talk. It's called the Independent Company. It costs £6 a month, including the VAT, and for that you get tons of extra content and discussions, plus regular live streams where we do the pod in a private pod to YouTube. And amongst the content, a pair of silver wings, James Holland's Tale of Love and Spitfires.
Beautifully read by Willow. I must drop her a note, actually.
By Willow Murray, my daughter, who was strong-armed into reading for us last year and actually really loved it and has done an amazing job on a couple of books for us. Last week, we had an exclusive screening of a new documentary about a young man who wanted to find the family of a fallen Japanese soldier. His great-grandfather had brought back a Japanese Hinumaru flag covered in good luck messages, and he felt it should be returned to its rightful owners. It's an extraordinary story. And then on Twitter, someone else popped up, "Oh, my grandpa's got one of these." And obviously then the pressure's on to return it.
Yeah, then someone else had said, "Yeah, me too." And before we knew where we are, we had a dozen of them.
Yeah, it's a very, very moving film. It got very dusty during the live cast for many of our regular viewers. Next Monday, we've got Ian McGregor joining us to talk about the extraordinary research he's done on the Battle of Stalingrad. Absolutely incredible stuff that we've got coming with it, Ian. He'll be sharing some fabulous material, and if you're at all interested in that, do come along. And I know we don't do the Eastern Front enough. I think sometimes when we do the Eastern Front, we descend into sort of generalities, so it would be quite good. In fact, it would be brilliant to talk about the deep dive epic battle. To join the members club, go to Patreon. That's Patreon. Papa Alpha. Now, am I right in thinking the phonetic alphabet was different during the Second World War? Did it settle down?
Yeah.
Right. So
dog, easy, Charlie.
That's right. Ak was A as well for a bit, wasn't it? Because the First World War, they developed Able, but they develop a phonetic alphabet during the First World War, and they're all quite. So it's Tok, Emma, and all that sort of stuff. It's quite different. Anyway, that's Patreon, patreon.com/wehaveways. If you want to join, and now. Should we do this interesting correspondence from an Italian listener?
Yeah.
We have an Italian listener, first of all. How about that, eh?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Now, she's called Madeleine, and she says, "I started listening to current episodes of your brilliant podcast, and are now going back to the beginning on a binge." Oh, crikey. I just listened to an early episode where you talked about the Mafia and repeated a bit of Mussolini propaganda that is alive and well. He did not tame the Mafia. It's complicated, but there is a brilliant explanation in Italian, alas, in a recent book that goes through all the myths about fascism, including the one about trains, by Francesco Filippi. One thing in common about the Mafia and punctual trains myth is that information was controlled by the fascist state, Mussolini himself. In 1931... they passed a law that prohibited criticising the government or publishing negative news stories. So no reports about bad train service or mafia crime or parties at Downing Street. Hey, presto, it looks like trains are arriving when they should, and the mafia guys are concentrating on gardening and playing cards instead of putting horses' heads in people's beds. The mafia story is way more complex and interesting. Un saluto cordiale, Madeleine. There you go.
Well, grazie mille, Madeleine, is all I can say for that.
Prego.
But I would slightly question what she's saying there, because I don't think I ever said that the Mafia was tamed. What I said was it was dormant by 1943. And they did this big... So he sends over his strong-arm guy called Cesare Mori, who is this police officer from, I think, Milan or Turin or something like that. Yeah. Turin, I think.
To Sicily, right?
To Sicily, to kind of sort out the Mafia, because there's only one central authority, and that's Mussolini and the fascists, and you can't have all these mafioso types kind of sort of swanning around. Yeah. It's just not allowed. And he goes over there and he massively kicks ass, and he imprisons 11,000 mafiosi from Sicily alone, in prisons without trial, and they just languish there. And the senior mafia guys, a lot of them then hot-foot it over to America, which is one of the reasons why there are, because obviously there's huge opportunities in the United States. There's huge amounts of, I think something like over 1 million Sicilians moved to Italy in the kind of first decade of the 20th century. So there's lots of connections over there. There's lots of opportunities, and you can sort of lie low. Yeah. It's absolutely, without question, that the Mafia was still very much kind of beating and alive and operating. Throughout the 1930s, because Mori goes back to Italy in 1930 or something like that. So absolutely it was. But what you haven't got anymore is sort of small-time bandits, cattle rustlers, all this kind of stuff. They've basically been locked up. What you've got is the main mafia organisation still in Sicily, but kind of keeping a much lower profile. And... they are absolutely doing stuff and absolutely keeping, and they're just sort of biding their time, and they're still sort of keeping a grip of things, but they're not as overt as they were.
Yeah.
And there is a possibility that the Mafia could have just sort of eventually kind of sort of been kicked into touch and sort of just become irrelevant, had it not been for the Allied invasion in 1943.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, the one thing where Madeline is absolutely correct is, of course, anything to do with the Mafia is incredibly complex, multi-layered, nuanced, and all those sort of things.
Well, and also it's one of those sort of phenomena where it adapts and survives, doesn't it? So, you
absolutely,
know, they imprison all the high-profile people, and so I mean, after all, we all know about mafia operations being run from inside prisons. So it's not like that. It's not like that has ever stopped anybody, is it? You know.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think to say they were sort of lying dormant in the kind of by the end of the 1930s, 1940s is that's probably a justified way of saying it. It's probably a bit more than dormant, because dormant suggests that it's completely asleep and it's not really happening. But it absolutely is happening. But what is absolutely without question is that the Mafia is given a kind of a massive reboot once the Allies come into power.
Yeah.
And once the Allies not come into power, and once the Allies get into Sicily.
Well, for all
and the whole Allied civil affairs is completely run by the Mafia.
Yeah. Yes, for all sorts of cynical, bitter reasons. Basically, it's like it's just easier to do it, isn't it?
Yeah, well, you've got an organisation there which has tentacles, you know, very, very strong tentacles in the US.
Yep.
You want to conquer Sicily as quickly as possible. You have no idea what the opposition's going to be when you're making all the plans.
Yep.
And you've got an organisation which is anti-fascist, which is anti the current regime, and which can foment discord and things. I think you'd probably want to use it.
Well, I think anti-fascist is quite an interesting way of describing that. I mean, opposed to government.
Yes, but very, very well. Not entirely opposed to government. Actually,
well, you know what? Well.
Opposed to a central dictator telling them what they can and can't do. What they like is governments where they're given a free hand to do whatever the hell they like.
Yeah, exactly. So, and opposed to democratic governments that insist on the rule of law and impartial,
yes, that as well.
Impartial courts and
that as well. Absolutely. But the point is, if you've got that group there, you might as well, you know, from an Allied point of view, you're going to do anything you can to ease your passage into Sicily.
I mean, the Mafia is anti-communist too, isn't it? Let's be honest now. The Mafia is...
it's basically anti-everything apart from them being given a free ride. Yeah, that is very true.
So anyway, tell us about the Pacific. You've been looking at the Pacific. Right?
Well, hold on. I just want to tell you something else that came in, which was really nice. So I got an email out of the blue from a chap called Jeff Morn, who'd been reading Brothers in Arms.
Yes.
And he said, I was particularly struck by your account of the death of Dennis Elmore and the grief of his friends at his sudden loss just days before the final surrender. So Dennis Elmore was killed on the 19th of April, just outside Bremen.
Yeah.
Dennis's parents lived next door to my grandparents in Hildenborough, Kent, and were good friends of our family.
My God.
As a young boy destined to go to Tunbridge School myself, I remember visiting Dennis's home in the 1950s and meeting his parents, Nora and John Elmore. Mrs. Elmore took me upstairs to Dennis's bedroom. She kept it like a shrine to her son. The room was exactly the way he had left it the day he went off to France, and she dusted and cleaned it faithfully in his memory. I don't think she ever got over his loss. He was her blue-eyed boy, and this must have been difficult for Dennis's sister Sheila.
Blimey.
I know.
Blimey.
I know. I read that and I just thought, holy moly.
Gosh.
Yeah. So I was really touched to get that note, and
well, it's very moving it's very moving in Brothers in Arms when you get to that. Anyway.
Well, I was moved by it. I can tell you. I mean, you know, that incredible letter from Stuart Hills, who's his best friend, who's they've been besties since they went to Tunbridge together. They kind of opened the batting at Lord's in summer of 1942 together. They kind of went off to war together, joined the Sherwood Rangers. And that letter he writes where he just says, you know, I loved him more than anyone else in the world, and the bottom has fallen out of my world. Yeah. You know, that raw grief is incredible.
Heartbreaking.
Yeah. You know, and life doesn't just go on. I mean, it
No.
does, but
Well, the
it
problem is it doesn't, doesn't it? Is that it has to. That's the thing with grief, isn't it? Is it casts that pall, that shadow.
Yeah.
Yeah. By creating absence. I mean, it's the strangest thing to deal with. Right now, so the Pacific, Jim. You said you were. Well, I'll tell you what. We'll take a break and then we'll come back to the Pacific. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland. We haven't gone around the houses exactly in that first part, but we've been suitably digressionary. But now we're going to talk. The Pacific. You've been looking into the war in the East, Jim.
Yeah, well, I do think sort of, Midway is such a remarkable and crucial victory that we were talking about earlier on.
Yeah,
because it's the time where the Americans attacking the Japanese at their strongest.
Yeah,
the Japanese have not really, the Japanese Navy hasn't really been confronted, so they're all really highly trained. They're incredibly highly motivated. All the commanders are top notch. They all know what they're about. They've got all their kit is pretty much up to date.
Yeah,
and so it's such a vital victory, because although there are further Japanese victories, that's the big kind of decisive one that kind of points the way to a kind of sort of a growing, gradual, incremental growing trend of American dominance, which is obviously powered first and foremost by their greater industrialization. But amazingly, although that is the summer of Midway is Midway in the Pacific, Midway in the summer of 1942.
Yeah,
you've then got the decisive Battle of Guadalcanal. So if Midway is the big naval engagement which changed things, Guadalcanal is then the subsequent land battle that also changes things, because it turns into a slugging match in which which side can supply the island better is going to win, and obviously that ends up being the US.
Yeah,
but then you've got 1943. So Guadalcanal and the Solomons, that takes you into kind of February 1943. It's a big old battle from kind of August onwards, August 42 to February 1943. So that's a long time.
Yeah.
And then you've got the rest of the Solomons, and you've got sort of going into New Guinea and bypassing Rabaul and all that kind of stuff. So that's 1943. And so by the end of 1943, all those sort of, Trident and those big Allied conferences, they're trying to work out what's going on.
Yeah,
what's the priority and how do we do this? And we've got to sort of, we've now, this is now the autumn of 1943.
Yeah,
and you're thinking, well, hang on a minute, we've got to sort of, haven't we got to get a shift on with this? Well, yes, absolutely, because the situation is starting to turn in Europe. So a bit more focus can be thrown at the Pacific, and we now know where, from an Allied point of view, they now know where they're at and what they can do and what can be achieved and what can be achieved in the future with the things that are coming through. The B-29 project, which isn't there yet, but is in the pipeline. Increased number of US submarines, increased number of just US ships, full stop.
Yeah.
And there is this, as you know, there's this huge divergence about what to do. What should be the strategy? Should it be the Central Pacific? You've done the South Pacific, which is the Solomons, all those little islands, north of Australia and all the rest of it. So now you're going to the Central Pacific, which is all those little atolls, the Marianas, the Gilberts, the Marshall Islands, which sort of sprinkle across the Central Pacific. Then you've got the main to the kind of west of that. You've then got the kind of Asian Pacific landmass. You've got the Philippines. You've got you've got Malaya and Thailand and China.
Yeah.
So the rough kind of naval argument. And this is Admiral King's argument. So Admiral King is he is the top naval dog. He's the chief of the naval staff. He's the absolute overall in charge. Whereas Nimitz is the guy
having to actually enact the things.
He's a sort of commander. He's the top admiral in charge of the navy. But King is the kind of overall kind of overseer of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And King's big argument is, if you want to beat Japan, you've got to kind of cut off their supply lines.
Yeah.
That's the way to do it. You can argue you can go into the Philippines and you can carry on fighting in Burma, but that's actually not going to stop the Japanese. What you really want to do is have a noose around Japan's home islands and cut that off and cut out their ability to supply themselves, and then they're stuffed.
Yeah.
There is still obviously a very, very good argument for fighting in Burma and for destroying the Burma army area, because that has a direct effect on southern China. Yeah. And supplies into across the hump and all the rest of it.
Yeah, America's obligations to China.
Yes, and if you can cut off the Burma Road, which goes into, which is a supply line from Rangoon, then that's obviously really, really good as well, and that will ease the situation in China. But to a large extent, King's right. The cause of conflict is that MacArthur has said, when he leaves Philippines, I will return.
Yeah.
And it's more than just beating Japan. It's him getting back and his ego and and all the rest of it. So there's a conflict going on between kind of the army and the Navy, the US Navy and the US Army. But to a certain extent,
a tale as old as time. That though, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely, it is. And both MacArthur and, King is kind of superior to MacArthur, and King is in kind of Washington and talking to the chiefs of staff all the time, whereas MacArthur is in, he's in Northern Australia. So he's clearly King's going to have the sort of greatest influence.
Yeah.
But there is no question that the logistics and challenges of fighting the Central Pacific campaign are absolutely huge.
Yeah.
But there are things that kind of work very much in the US favour, and that is that by beginning of 1944, end of 1943, beginning of 1944, the Japanese are just in the most enormous hole from the point of view of their navy.
Yeah.
And generally, because of course, as we know, they've been, Japan as a nation has been fighting a war since 1937.
Well, they've been at it basically forever, haven't they? The Japanese are first in, last out in the Second World War, aren't they? Essentially.
Yes.
And when we talked to Rob not so long ago, Rob Lyman not so long ago, he posits that basically that the Pearl Harbor's the last roll of their dice, of the Japanese dice. And the series of campaigns that go with it, all those imperial grabs in the Far East are all their last chance, because they're trying to keep the war the only way to keep the war in China going is to start a war somewhere else, because otherwise the whole thing just will suck back into itself and collapse. It's the accumulator betting.
But and Rob was talking about, wasn't he? He was talking about the fact that they had all this oil from Burma.
Yeah, and they don't do anything, and they literally don't do anything with it. Yeah.
That's because they can't.
Yeah.
It's because by the time they need it, by the time they've got it, they're running out of shipping.
Yeah.
And what's the priority? And the priority is to maintain the status quo. So it's supplying the troops on these atolls in, the Marianas and the Marshalls and the Gilberts, is taking priority over getting oil back.
Yeah.
Because supplying those atolls and maintaining your status quo, maintaining that huge area, that huge sweep of the Pacific, on which you can control, is right there and then their priority.
Yeah.
But of course, it's bonkers, because then they kind of only lose it. But once they lose it, of course, then they're starting to get in range of American air force. So the point is they've just overextended. Well, and they can't do it. They're then caught in a trap where they can't retrench, but they can't afford to keep it either.
Well, it turns into the man who defends everything defends nothing, doesn't it? Because basically they're exposing themselves to lots and lots of points of attrition. And you have to supply each of these places, which exposes your shipping, which exposes your, by creating these issues of supply lines, they offer themselves hostages to the Americans, essentially, don't they? It's a sort of as simple as that, isn't it? Which is interesting, because if island hopping and bypassing some of the islands is the strategy the Americans end up at, kind of whatever the Japanese do, they're offering the Americans targets. They're offering them points of attrition and points of destruction, aren't they?
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
So it's a strategy that can only really go wrong. Whereas had they been more, I mean, it's the question we asked. We were talking to Rob. We asked him, well, and who else did we talk about this? Is Pearl Harbor inevitable? We talked about this in December week, didn't we? Do the Japanese have an option not to go into Pearl Harbor, and obviously not to attack the Americans, not to involve the Americans, and obviously they feel they have no option but to. But it's in many ways it's like Barbarossa. It's that it's all very well it going well for the first bit. It's then the opportunities you offer your enemy by exposing yourself so massively. You know what I mean? They're very, very similar to one another in a way, aren't they? Because Barbarossa is sort of betting on an accumulator and rolling the dice because you've run out of stuff, you've run out of road, and which is the Adam II's argument, of course, is it's much more to do with that than it is ideologically motivated, and you could, is that what's influencing Japanese thinking? And it's interesting they kind of happen around about the same time. Those, it's all very, how tangled that. I mean, obviously, my thing with my feeling about what Adam II says is yes, but look at the people who are in charge. Who's to say they're making rational economic decisions anyway? Because they're all
which they're clearly not, are they?
They're all balmy. So, oh God, there's a cup of tea has just arrived. Oh, it's
in a Monty mug as well.
In a Monty mug, a cup of coffee in my Monty mug.
That's very good. That's very good.
Black Java. But you know what I mean. So, I mean,
completely.
But the thing that's really striking, though, if you go back to Midway, is how aggressive the Americans are being immediately. There isn't.
Well, it's also against a really, really good opposition.
Well, but that's my point. That's exactly my point. If you as a because essentially Midway is the first time the Americans have gathered their skirts and it's their first proper reaction to Pearl Harbor. It's the Billy Mitchell raid, whatever that's propaganda, isn't it? Really, that air raid more than anything else.
The Doolittle raid.
The Doolittle. Sorry, yes. Why did I say Billy Mitchell? What's he got to do with it? The Doolittle raid. Yeah. Anyway, that's propaganda, isn't it? But the way they're being so aggressive when they are and they know they're mismatched, and it's interesting in the battle itself on Midway. The Japanese have this doctrine of what you do is you launch everything all at once for the absolute maximum concentration of force.
The Schwerpunkt.
Exactly, and they're simply applying those very simple principles to carrier warfare. The Americans are like, we haven't practiced that. We don't have that up our sleeve. So we're just going to, Spruance is like, we're just going to chuck everything we possibly can in whatever order. I don't care. We just need to, and they rationalize it as it'll confuse them and it'll create a permanent rolling problem for the Japanese rather than, actually if all of our aircraft all turned up at once, we'd do for them. And as the battle plays out, that works for the Americans, but it's not because they've got their shit together particularly, is it?
Well, but it's also that. So it's about. I mean, if you think about the Japanese fleet, neither of them no one has done huge, great kind of carrier actions at sea before. This is brand new. But what the Japanese have been doing is doing carrier operations off China. In 1937, 1938, and what have you, and sending it, so they have got combat experience. They haven't got combat experience of kind of taking on another fleet. The Americans are even kind of further behind the ball in terms of experience. Yeah. What you've got with the Japanese, though, is their carrier pilots are just supremely well trained. So they've got a very, very good, the fighter like the Zero, for example, is a really good, highly manoeuvrable plane, and although it's kind of weakly armoured, in the hands of really, really experienced pilots, and you've got 500 hours in your logbook before you're kind of going operational. That's at a level that not even by 1944 the Allies are.
But Jim, that's also a mark of the fact that the Japanese are halfway through their war. That when in 41,
it is. But
41, they're halfway through, and the Americans are like, jump starting themselves.
Which is what, but this is why Midway is so important because it gives them a bloody nose, and then there are these series of attritional naval battles off the coast of Guadalcanal, some of which the Americans come out on top, some of which the Japanese come out on top. But the attritional kind of so there are some tactical victories for the Japanese, but there are strategic, the overall strategic victory for an operational victory for the Americans. by the end of 1943, beginning of 1944, there hadn't been a huge amount of naval engagements in 1943. What the Americans realised is what we need to do is we need to get the Japanese Navy into a decisive navy.
To come to battle. Well,
to come to battle, and how do we do that?
But this again and again in American thinking, in American strategy, is what they like to do, is bring a battle. Big week.
Yeah.
The Americans
pull it together.
The way we're going to do this is we're going to create a situation where they have to engage us. They've got no option but to engage us, and we'll use it to inflict irreversible damage to their operational strategic assets, isn't it? That's it's very interesting that's a recurrent theme in American military thinking, isn't it? Is that historic? Does that come from the American Civil War? Where's it? You know what I mean? Because after all, broad front. Eisenhower's broad front is Grant's broad front, isn't it? You know, it's
yeah. Well, I think it probably does come from that, doesn't it? I suspect so. But it's really interesting because
yeah,
you know, by the beginning of 1943, you know, it's all changed. You know, Yamamoto's been replaced. You've got Admiral Ozawa Jizaburo, who is the commander of the first mobile fleet, and the first mobile fleet is what's got, you know, that is. Yeah. All the surface and carrier battle groups of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Yeah. And Ozawa Jizaburo's flagship is a carrier called the Taiho.
Yep.
And this is absolutely state of the art. You know, it's radio controlled anti-aircraft guns, it's got, you know, sweeping radar, it's got armoured flight deck, it's got it's absolutely cutting edge. But they've rushed it into being. You know, it's sort of laid down in 1941. It's kind of ready by the end of 1943, beginning of 1944. And it's so complex that they have to make the engineering officer commander because he's the only one who knows how to sail it properly.
Oh dear.
And then when they do sea trials, it's absolutely abundantly clear that they just don't know how to operate. You know, no one is trained enough because they've had so many losses by this stage. That they're having to kind of pummel these people in without the training that they had in the 1930s, and so it's this amazing carrier.
So hold on,
and of course it gets sunk in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which is the big naval engagement that brings them all to in June 1944.
So are you saying that an Axis power went too far technologically and spent valuable money, time, resources, and trained personnel on a piece of kit that was a white elephant? You're not suggesting that an Axis power might
I might be suggesting that too. So by that stage, by 1944, you know, the Japanese Navy is still incredibly strong.
Yeah.
I mean, 6 battleships, 9 carriers, 500 aircraft, 13 cruisers, 28 destroyers. But then you look at the 5th Fleet. Yes. Okay, so this is just the 5th fleet. Yeah. It's not the 7th, it's not the 3rd, this is the 5th fleet. Task Force 58. Commanded, you know, overall, 5th Fleet is commanded by Admiral Spruance, our old friend.
Yeah.
7 fast battleships, 15 carriers of 891 aircraft, 21 cruisers of all types, and 69 destroyers. And that's before you've also included the submarines. So the Japanese just do not, it's just not going to happen for them.
Now, I mean, that naval commitment, I know it's Germany first.
It's huge.
I know it's Germany first, right?
It's Germany only just first.
I mean, it sounds pretty neck and neck, that doesn't it? If that's just the 5th Fleet. How interesting, because that's the expensive stuff. Ships are really bloody expensive, aren't they? Lots of big ships with lots of aircraft on. That's
all the ships that are supplying those ships.
Oh yeah.
And setting up depots on, Pacific atolls
and the oil
on Guam, you know, which later gets captured in the, well, that's part of the Marianas, isn't it? But you know, it's absolutely extraordinary, and it's just been fascinating delving into this and just seeing how kind of woeful the situation is. So in other words, you've got this. The Japanese by 1944 have still got a technologically cutting edge navy.
Yeah.
But they haven't got the operational prowess to go with it.
I want to talk about Dill at some point as well, because I've been reading about Dill.
Yes. Okay, well, let's do that.
Completely forgotten.
The
forgotten hero of the Second World War. I mean, Dill.
World War II.
Dill is absolutely right in there, and he never gets talked about.
Well, we've done a tiny little bit of rehabilitating of Admiral Leahy, haven't we? So maybe we should do.
Look at Dill,
General Dill,
because he's
Dill
the
Marshal Dill.
Phil Marshall Dill. He's the missing link, and of course, because he dies, no memoirs, no, doesn't get to write his version of events, and Churchill essentially, vanishes him, doesn't he, from the account because they fell out. Yeah. Anyway, that's all from us for today. Thanks very much for listening. On Thursday, we have Caroline Shenton talking about hidden art in the Second World War. I think that's right. And live casts, Patreon, all sorts of stuff. And the festival. Don't forget the We Have Ways Festival. A good time, guaranteed for all. Terms and conditions apply. You have to be a Second World War to like it. Nerd to like it. We will see you all soon. Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Cheerio.